The haunting story of Camille Holland. Victorian England's deadliest deception. A woman of private means, London, autumn of 1899. A narrow street off the Bayswater Road. Gas lamps just starting to flicker on. A hansom cab clatters past somewhere out of sight, wheels hitting cobblestone, and then it's quiet again. Inside one of the terraced houses, a woman sits at a small writing desk, tea gone cold beside her. She's not doing anything remarkable, just sitting. Thinking maybe, or not thinking at all, the way you do at the end of a long day when nothing in particular has happened. Her name is Camille Cecile Holland, 56 years old, and by the standards of the day, she was doing fine. Better than fine, really. I want to sit with that word for a second, comfortable, because it matters more than it sounds like it should. Comfort is what made Camille Holland exactly the kind of person a certain type of man goes looking for. She was born in 1848, never married, which, in 1899, was still the sort of thing people noticed, even if they didn't say it out loud. Camille had her own money, inherited, well managed, enough to keep a small staff, dress properly, come and go as she pleased, without asking anyone's permission. This wasn't scandalous. An unmarried woman with means wasn't pitied exactly, though the word spinster probably followed her around at family dinners, whether she heard it or not. She was independent, full stop. No husband to account to, no father hovering. Her house, her rules, her tea at 4 o'clock sharp. For close to 20 years she'd lived like this. Quiet lodgings around London and the home counties. A small circle of people she knew. Letters to relatives who thought of her fondly, but not often. If you'd walked past her on a London street in early 1898, you wouldn't have looked twice. Well-dressed woman, middle-aged, going about her business. One face in a city of 6 million. But there was a hole in that comfortable life, and it's the hole. Not any particular foolishness on Camille's part that put her on the road to Essex, and eventually into the ground. She was lonely, not in some big dramatic way. Nobody was finding her in tears. It was quieter than that. The low-level loneliness of a woman who'd built a nice, orderly life and simply had no one to hand it to. No husband to tell about her day. No children. Relatives who cared about her the way you care about someone you don't see enough. Genuinely, but from a distance. I think it's worth stopping on this, actually, because it's the kind of detail that's easy to skate past. Predators, and I use that word deliberately here, rarely show up looking like a threat. They show up looking like an answer to a question you didn't even know you'd been asking. Sometime in late 1898, a man walked into Camille's life calling himself Samuel Herbert Dougal. Tall, silver-haired, carried himself like a military man, and said he was one, talked about a long career in the army, postings in various far-flung corners of the empire, that sort of thing. People who met him described a kind of easy charm, the sort that makes strangers relax almost immediately. He was good at that. Very good. Nobody's entirely sure how the two of them met. A mutual acquaintance maybe, a train journey, a shared boarding house. The details get fuzzy the further back you dig. What we do know is what came after. Dougal courted her. Properly, patiently, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And he did. He complimented her. He listened, or looked like he was listening, which for most people amounts to the same thing. He talked about settling down somewhere quiet, away from London's noise and expense, two like-minded people building a peaceful life together. He was describing more or less the exact future a woman in Camille's position might have quietly hoped for, and never quite admitted to hoping for. What Camille didn't know, couldn't have known, was that almost none of it was true. Dougal had served in the army, yes, but his record was patchy, more disciplinary trouble than distinction. He'd been married at least twice, possibly involved with several other women along the way, some of it overlapping in ways that would have horrified polite society if anyone had known. One of his wives had died under circumstances nobody had really looked into closely at the time, a detail that wouldn't mean much to investigators until years later, when they finally went digging into his past. He had, in short, a pattern. Attach himself to a woman with money of her own, take what he could, move on when things got complicated. Camille wasn't his first. She would be his last. By early 1899, the relationship had moved fast enough that, looking back, it's hard not to wince a little. Within months, they were talking about a life together. Dougal proposed sharing a household, not marriage, curiously, though he'd let people assume otherwise when it suited him. He wanted land, somewhere private, somewhere far from London. So, why did she go along with it? A 56-year-old woman, sharp enough to have run her own affairs for 2 decades, agreeing to uproot everything for a man she'd known a few months? I don't think it's a question that deserves judgment. Loneliness does this to people. It narrows what you're willing to question. Warmth, once you've been starved of it a while, starts to feel too precious to interrogate too closely. And Dougal was good. Really good at handing out exactly the kind of warmth a lonely woman wants, in exactly the tone she wants to hear it in. It's also worth saying, Camille wasn't naive with her money, not entirely. There's no clear evidence, she simply signed everything over to him. If anything, what happened next suggests a woman who kept some caution, even while she gave her trust elsewhere, which honestly makes what was coming even more disturbing. This wasn't a con that worked because the victim was careless. It worked because the man running it was patient. In the spring of 1899, the two of them started house hunting, not just anywhere, somewhere isolated. An old English farmhouse, timbered, centuries of history in the walls, and, this is the detail that seemed to seal it, a moat. An actual water-filled moat, left over from some long-forgotten medieval defense, wrapped around a farmhouse near the village of Clavering, out in the flat Essex countryside. The place was called Moat Farm. Miles from the nearest railway station, fields on every side, hedgerows thick enough to keep neighbors from seeing much of anything. To a Londoner, tired of coal smoke and crowds, it probably looked like a dream. To anyone thinking a bit harder about what isolated actually means for a woman moving in with a man nobody really knew, it might have looked like something else. Camille loved it. She had the money to buy it outright, and by spring, the papers were moving. That old farmhouse, the timbers, the water around it, the distance from anyone who might ask questions, was about to be hers. She had no way of knowing, signing those papers, that she wasn't buying her future. She was choosing where her story would end. Next time, Camille and Samuel Dougal leave London behind for Essex, and we meet the small household of servants who would become the last people to really see Camille Holland alive. What they saw, what they were told, and what they were never allowed to ask. The captain's charm. Let's back up a little. Before Moat Farm, before the moat, the farmhouse, any of it. Let's talk about who Samuel Herbert Dougal actually was. Not the man he told Camille he was, but the one underneath. Because that's really the engine of this whole story. Not the murder itself. Not yet. The lie that came before it. The years and years of practice it took to build a man who could walk into a lonely woman's life and make himself look like the answer to everything. Dougal was born in 1846, 2 years before Camille. Grew up in relatively ordinary circumstances, joined the army as a young man. And here's where the story he told people, and the story that actually happened, start to pull apart. He liked to describe himself later as a retired captain, a man of some military distinction. The truth was messier. He did serve. He was in the Royal Artillery for a while, saw some postings abroad, but his record was full of trouble, the kind of thing that gets glossed over in dinner party conversation and left out entirely from resumes. Disciplinary issues, at least one court-martial, not exactly the stuff of a distinguished career, though you'd never have guessed it from the way he carried himself. That's worth pausing on, actually. The gap between how a person carries himself and what's actually true about him. Dougal had somehow figured out, probably by accident at first, and then very deliberately, that most people don't check. They take the posture, the accent, the confident way a man says, "When I was stationed in," and fills in someplace most of his listeners have never been and never will go. Nobody in a London drawing room in 1898 was writing to the War Office to confirm anyone's service record. You just believed what a man told you, especially if he told it well. And Dougal told things well. By the time he met Camille, he'd already been married. Twice, as far as anyone's been able to establish with real confidence. Possibly more, if you count relationships that never made it to a church. His first wife died young, officially of natural causes. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Why would they? Young women died of all kinds of things in Victorian England. Fever, childbirth, 100 illnesses that don't carry the same weight of dread now that they did then. It's only in hindsight, once you know what Dougal was capable of, that the death starts to look less like bad luck and more like the first entry in a pattern. His second marriage ended the way a lot of his relationships seemed to end. Badly, and with money somehow having moved in his direction along the way. There were other women too, overlapping sometimes, in ways that would have been genuinely scandalous if anyone outside his immediate circle had known the extent of it. He had children he barely supported, debts he didn't pay, a habit apparently well established by the 1890s of finding women with some independent income and attaching himself to them until the money ran dry or the situation got too hot to hold together. None of this showed on the surface. That's the part that's hard to get your head around, even now. People who met Dougal in the years before he crossed paths with Camille described him consistently. Charming, well-spoken, generous in that easy way that costs a man nothing when he's spending someone else's money. He had a talent for making people feel like the only person in the room. It's a specific skill. Not everyone has it. The people who do can be genuinely dangerous because it doesn't feel like manipulation from the inside. It feels like being liked. So, Camille. A woman with money of her own, unmarried, living quietly, no husband checking her mail or asking who she'd been spending time with. From where Dougal was standing, she would have looked less like a person and more like an opportunity. I don't say that to be cold about it. I say it because it's apparently exactly how he operated, again and again, with a consistency that's almost clinical when you lay it all out in a row. The courtship, if you can call it that, moved efficiently. He would have asked about her, listened to the small details people give away without noticing, how she managed her money, who she answered to, no one, how often she saw her family, not often. Every one of those answers would have told him the same thing. She was reachable. She was alone enough that a patient, charming man could become the center of her world without much competition. We don't have Camille's letters from this period, or if they existed, they didn't survive in any form historians have been able to recover. So we're left imagining her side of it. which is its own kind of sad. A woman in her 50s, comfortable but unaccompanied, meeting a man who seems to genuinely want to know her, who remembers what she says, who talks about a future that includes her in it. It's not hard to understand why she said yes to whatever he was proposing. Most of us in her position would have wanted to believe it too. There's a detail that comes up in some of the later accounts. Small, easy to miss, but telling. Dougal apparently discouraged Camille from staying too close to her family as their relationship developed. Not dramatically. No big confrontations, nothing anyone could point to and call controlling. Just a gentle, steady redirection. The countryside would be better for her health. London was expensive and crowded. Her relatives were busy anyway, weren't they? So why trouble them? The kind of thing that sounds reasonable one sentence at a time and only looks like isolation once you step back and look at the whole pattern. By early 1899, whatever doubts Camille might have carried, and we don't know how many she had, or whether she had any at all, had given way to something like commitment. She and Dougal were, in the practical sense, if not the legal one, planning a life together. And Dougal, for his part, was doing what he'd apparently done before, steering things toward property, toward money, toward a location where he'd have more control over the shape of things than he'd ever had in a rented London room. It's tempting, telling a story like this, to make Dougal into some kind of criminal mastermind, cold, calculating, 3 steps ahead the whole way through. The truth is probably less cinematic, and honestly, more unsettling. He doesn't seem to have been especially brilliant. What he had was practice. He'd done versions of this before, with other women, and learned from each one what worked and what didn't. By the time he found Camille, he wasn't improvising. He was running a routine he'd refined through repetition, the charm, the attentiveness, the slow narrowing of a woman's world until he was standing at the center of it. Camille Holland didn't know any of this. She knew a tall, silver-haired man who called her by name in a way that made her feel seen, who talked about a quiet farmhouse in the country the way other men might talk about a wedding ring. She knew what he wanted her to know. And in the spring of 1899, she agreed to leave London behind for a piece of land she'd never lived near, in a village she'd probably never heard of before he mentioned it, with a man she'd known for less than a year. Next time, we follow them there, to Moat Farm itself, and to the small household of servants who would spend the following weeks watching something in that house slowly, quietly, go wrong. The village of Clavering sits in that particular stretch of Essex that doesn't get much attention. No dramatic hills, no coastline, just flat worked farmland running out toward a low horizon, hedgerows cutting the fields into uneven squares, church spires poking up every few miles to mark where one parish ends and another begins. In 1899, it would have been quieter still. A scatter of cottages, a church, a pub, maybe a shop or two, and beyond that, farms stretching in every direction, most of them worked by families who'd been on that same land for generations. Moat Farm sat about 1.5 miles outside the village proper, isolated even by the standards of a place that was already fairly isolated. You'd have had to walk it, or take a cart, down a narrow track that turned to mud whenever it rained, which in Essex was often. The nearest railway station was miles off. No shops nearby. No neighbors close enough to glance out a window and see who was coming and going. And then there was the moat itself. It's an odd thing to picture now. A genuine water-filled moat around an ordinary farmhouse. Nothing like a castle. Just old brick and timber, centuries of patched repairs, a working farm with outbuildings and a bit of land attached. The moat wasn't there for defense anymore, obviously. It was a leftover, a piece of medieval engineering that had outlived its original purpose by 400 or 500 years and simply never been filled in. Stagnant in places, reeds growing up along the edges, the kind of feature that might have seemed romantic to a Londoner tired of city noise, and mildly ominous to anyone who stopped to think about what it would mean, practically speaking, to live somewhere with your own private ring of water, separating you from the rest of the world. Camille apparently loved it. We don't have her exact words. Nothing survives that tells us precisely what she felt, walking the grounds for the first time, seeing the old farmhouse with its uneven floors and its heavy timbers. But everything about how quickly the purchase moved suggests enthusiasm rather than hesitation. By the spring of 1899, the sale was going through. Camille Holland, using her own money, became the legal owner of Moat Farm. It's worth sitting with that detail for a second, because it matters later. The farm was hers, not Dougal's. Her name on the deed, her money behind the purchase. Whatever else was happening beneath the surface of their relationship, Camille hadn't simply handed over control of her assets. She was still, on paper, an independent woman making her own decisions. Which makes what happened over the following months so much stranger and so much harder to explain away as simple financial ruin. They moved in together that spring, unmarried, which would have raised eyebrows in the village even if nobody said so directly to their faces. Clavering was small. People noticed. A well-dressed woman from London, a silver-haired man who called himself Captain Dougal, setting up house together at an isolated farm with a moat around it. That's the kind of arrangement that gets talked about at the pub, turned over at the church door after Sunday service, folded into the slow, steady gossip that moves through small communities, whether anyone means for it to or not. They hired staff, as a household of their apparent standing would have been expected to. A servant girl, young, local, the kind of position that would have been considered a decent job for a girl from a farming family in that part of Essex. Her name comes up in the later records as Florence Havies, though spellings and details vary depending on which account you're reading, which is common enough with servants from this period. Their lives got recorded only in fragments, mostly when something happened around them worth writing down. Florence would end up being one of the last people to spend real time around Camille Holland while she was still alive. And later, one of the people whose account of those final weeks would matter enormously, though at the time, she had no way of knowing that. By all appearances, the household settled into something like a routine that spring. Camille managing the domestic side of things, the way a woman of her background would have been raised to do, overseeing meals, managing the small staff, keeping up correspondence with whatever family and acquaintances she still had contact with. Dougal, for his part, played the role of country gentleman, walked the grounds, talked about improvements he wanted to make to the farm, presented himself to anyone who visited or passed through as a settled, respectable man, building a life with his companion. But underneath that surface, something else was apparently happening. And this is where the story gets harder to trace with real precision, because so much of what we know comes from testimony given years later, after everything had already gone wrong, memory reshaped inevitably by hindsight and by knowing how the story ends. What does seem clear is that Dougal had, by this point, already begun making other arrangements. There's evidence he was corresponding with or actively courting other women during this same period, even while living with Camille at Moat Farm. Whether Camille had any idea this was happening is genuinely unclear. It's possible she suspected nothing. It's possible she suspected everything and had no idea what to do with the suspicion, isolated as she now was. A woman in her 50s in an unfamiliar corner of rural Essex, a long way from the London life she'd left behind, and the people who might have noticed if something felt wrong. There are also signs, small, easy to overlook in isolation, but significant in retrospect, that money had started moving. Dougal apparently had access to funds that, strictly speaking, weren't his. Whether Camille had given him some formal authority over parts of her finances, or whether he'd simply started helping himself in smaller ways she hadn't fully tracked, isn't entirely clear from the surviving records. What is clear is that by the time we reach the spring of 1899, a pattern that would become devastatingly obvious in hindsight was already, quietly, taking shape. The farm itself needed work. Old buildings, uneven land, the kind of ongoing maintenance any working property demands. Dougal threw himself into it, or gave every appearance of doing so, directing laborers, discussing plans for the outbuildings, acting every bit the settled countryman, with a project in front of him and years ahead of him to see it through. It's almost peaceful, this part of the story, if you don't know what's coming. A farmhouse in the Essex countryside, a moat catching the spring light, a woman finally free of London's noise, building something with a man she believed loved her. Servants going about their work, the ordinary rhythm of a household finding its footing. That peace didn't last. By the end of April, less than 2 months after the household had properly settled in, something shifted. And what happened next, sudden, quiet, and almost entirely unexplained to the people around them, would mark the last time anyone in Clavering could say, with real certainty, that they had seen Camille Holland alive. Next time, the disappearance. What Dougal told the servants, what nobody thought to question, and the 4 years of silence that followed.
The disappearance. It's the 19th of May 1899, a Friday. We know this date with unusual precision, actually, more precision than most of what came before it in this story, because it's the last day anyone could later swear, under oath, that they'd seen Camille Holland alive. The account comes mostly from Florence, the young servant girl. According to what she told police years later, because at the time, remember, there was no reason for anyone to be asking her anything. Camille and Dougal went out together that afternoon. A drive, apparently. Dougal had a horse and trap, and taking Camille out for an afternoon drive around the countryside near Clavering wasn't unusual. They'd done it before. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary outing on an ordinary Friday. Dougal came back alone. He told Florence that Camille had decided, rather suddenly, to go up to London. Family matters, he said. Something involving relatives that required her attention. Nothing to worry about. She'd packed a small bag and gone off to catch a train. He was vague on the details in the way people often are when they're inventing details rather than reporting them. Florence, 17 or 18 years old, working for a household that wasn't hers, had no particular reason to push back on any of it. Why would she? Her employer's companion had told her a perfectly ordinary story about a perfectly ordinary trip, except Camille never packed. This is the detail that, looking back with everything we now know, should have set off alarm bells immediately. A woman doesn't simply vanish from an afternoon drive with no luggage, no goodbye to her own household staff, no note, nothing. And yet at the time, nobody thought to ask why the bag Dougal claimed she'd taken had never actually been seen leaving the house. Nobody thought to ask why a woman who was, by every account, careful and organized about her own affairs would leave for London without a word to the servant who managed her household. Dougal's explanation simply held. Not because it was airtight. Because nobody in Florence's position had any reason to interrogate it, and because Dougal, by this point, had spent months, arguably years, if you count his history with other women, perfecting the particular skill of saying things with enough calm authority that people didn't feel the need to check. Over the following days, the story shifted slightly, the way lies tend to do when the person telling them has to keep filling in gaps. Sometimes Camille had gone to stay with relatives. Sometimes she was traveling. At one point, Dougal apparently told people she'd gone abroad. The details depend on which account and which witness you're reading, because he told slightly different versions to different people, which itself is worth noticing. A person telling the truth generally tells the same story to everyone. A person managing a lie has to keep track of who's heard which version. What's genuinely remarkable, and this is the part that tends to unsettle people learning this story for the first time, is what Dougal did next. He didn't quietly disappear himself, didn't slip away from Moat Farm and vanish into obscurity the way you might expect a guilty man to do. He stayed. He kept living at the farm. And within days, not weeks, days, of Camille's disappearance, he began writing to Camille's bank, using her name. He forged her signature on letters and checks, requesting that funds be transferred, that certain sums be released, managing her financial affairs as though she were simply away and had asked him to handle things in her absence. It's a breathtaking piece of nerve, when you think about it plainly. Not clever in any deep sense, just brazen, relying entirely on the assumption that nobody at a London bank was going to travel out to rural Essex to confirm that a woman they'd never met in person was, in fact, still alive and had, in fact, authorized these transactions. For a while it worked. Camille's bank had no particular reason for suspicion. Signatures can be forged convincingly enough to pass casual inspection, especially in an era without the kind of verification systems we'd expect today. Letters arrived, apparently from Camille or on her behalf, requesting transfers and withdrawals, and the bank, doing what banks did, processed them. Meanwhile, back in Clavering, life at Moat Farm carried on with a strange, almost defiant normalcy. Dougal continued running the household. He kept Florence on as a servant. He paid the local tradesmen. He walked through the village, greeted people, behaved, by every outward measure, like a man whose life hadn't just been upended by his companion's sudden and unexplained absence. And then, within a remarkably short window of time, he began introducing other women into the house. Not secretly, either, or not entirely secretly. Accounts from this period describe Dougal bringing women to Moat Farm, sometimes presenting them to the remaining household staff under invented names, sometimes with a story attached about who they were and why they were there. One woman, according to later testimony, lived at the farm for a period and was introduced to at least some people as Dougal's wife. Think about that for a moment. A woman he'd been living with for less than 4 months had vanished on an afternoon drive, and within a short stretch of time, weeks, not years, he had already begun presenting a replacement to the community, in the very house where Camille's things presumably still sat untouched. Did anyone in Clavering find this strange? Almost certainly yes, on some level. Small villages notice everything. But noticing and acting are different things, especially in an era where a gentleman's private domestic arrangements weren't considered anyone else's business, and especially involving a man who carried himself with the easy, unbothered confidence of someone with nothing to hide. Suspicion, in a place like this, tends to stay where suspicion usually stays, in quiet conversations at the pub, in glances exchanged after church, in the kind of talk that circulates without ever quite turning into action. Camille's own relatives, meanwhile, were left largely in the dark. She'd written to some of them occasionally before her disappearance, nothing frequent, but enough that a prolonged silence should eventually have registered as unusual. Whether any of them wrote to Moat Farm asking after her, and what answers they received if they did, isn't entirely clear from the surviving record. What is clear is that no one, in these early months, escalated their concern into anything like a formal inquiry. There was no obvious crime to report. A woman going quiet for a while, even an independent woman with her own money and her own habits, wasn't automatically cause for police involvement in 1899. People traveled. People fell out of touch. Camille, as far as anyone outside that farmhouse knew, had simply gone somewhere and stopped writing. Dougal, for his part, settled into his new arrangement at Moat Farm with what can only be described as remarkable comfort. He continued managing the farm, continued drawing on Camille's funds through forged correspondence, continued presenting himself to the village as a respectable, settled man. Months passed. Then more months. The urgency that should have accompanied a genuinely alarming disappearance simply never materialized, because from the outside, nothing about the situation looked like a disappearance at all. It looked like an absence. A woman away visiting family, for an unusually long time, managed by a companion who seemed entirely unbothered by it. That absence would stretch on, astonishingly, for nearly 4 years. 4 years during which Dougal lived at Moat Farm, continued to draw on Camille's money, brought other women into the house, and maintained, to anyone who asked, and increasingly, fewer people were asking, that Camille Holland was simply away, and would surely be back one day, in her own time. Next time, the 4 years that followed. How suspicion finally began to build. And the moment someone, at last, asked the question nobody had thought to ask back in May of 1899. Where, exactly, is Camille Holland? 4 years of deception. Time does something strange to a lie, if it's allowed to sit long enough. It stops feeling like a lie and starts feeling like simply the way things are. By 1900, a year into Camille Holland's absence, that's more or less what had happened at Moat Farm. Dougal wasn't managing a crisis anymore. He was just living his life. The forged signatures on Camille's bank correspondence had become routine. The story about her being away, vague, shifting slightly depending on who was asking, had hardened into the accepted explanation, at least among the small circle of people who thought about it at all. And most people, most of the time, simply didn't. He kept bringing women to the farm. Some stayed briefly. At least one lived there for an extended period, presented to neighbors and to the remaining household staff as his wife, though no such marriage had taken place. Dougal, as far as anyone can determine, never remarried after his earlier marriages had ended, whatever the reasons for those endings had been. He fathered at least one child during this period with one of the women passing through his life at the farm, which tells you something about how settled and unremarkable this arrangement had become to him. This wasn't a man in hiding. This was a man who had built an entirely new, comfortable life on top of an unresolved disappearance, and didn't appear to be losing much sleep over it. Florence, the servant girl, stayed on for some of this period, though accounts differ on exactly how long. What she observed during these years. The parade of different women through the house, the complete absence of any further word from or about Camille, the casual way Dougal spoke of a woman who had supposedly just gone to visit family, and simply never come back, would matter enormously later, once someone finally started asking her the right questions. At the time, though, she was a young servant in a household run by her employer's confident, well-spoken companion. It wasn't really her place to challenge any of it, and there's no indication she felt equipped to. The money, meanwhile, kept moving. Dougal had, by various means, forged letters, forged signatures, and at some point what appears to have been a fairly bold piece of forgery involving a document meant to look like it transferred authority over parts of Camille's estate directly to him, gained access to a substantial portion of her funds. He used the money the way a man does when he believes the source is never going to run dry, renovating the farm, buying things, funding the lifestyle of a country gentleman with income he had no legitimate claim to. Some accounts suggest he even used portions of it to entertain the various women who passed through Moat Farm during this period, which is its own particular kind of grim, if you think about it. Spending a dead woman's money to court her replacements, in the very house where she'd been living when she vanished. It's worth asking, at this point in the story, why nobody caught on sooner. And the honest answer is a combination of things, none of them especially dramatic. Camille's bank, for one, had limited means of verifying signatures at a distance, and no particular reason to suspect fraud from a woman who had, as far as they knew, simply authorized her companion to manage things in her absence. Banking fraud detection in 1899 bore almost no resemblance to what exists today. A convincingly forged signature on a properly worded letter could carry enormous weight, especially when nobody on the other end had any reason yet to doubt it. Camille's relatives, for their part, appeared to have grown gradually more concerned as the silence stretched on, though the record here is frustratingly thin. Letters may have gone unanswered. Inquiries, if they were made, may have been met with the same vague explanations Dougal had been offering all along. She's traveling, she's staying with friends, she'll write when she's settled. It's easy, from a distance of over a century, to wonder why nobody simply traveled to Moat Farm and demanded to see her. But that kind of direct confrontation wasn't necessarily how respectable Victorian families handled uncomfortable situations involving an unmarried relative's personal choices. There would have been a reluctance to pry, a social instinct toward giving people the benefit of the doubt, especially a woman like Camille who had always managed her own affairs and would presumably not have appreciated relatives descending on her uninvited. And then there was Dougal himself, whose greatest asset throughout this entire stretch of years was simply his own composure. He never behaved like a man with something to hide. He didn't flee. He didn't grow evasive or paranoid in any way that outside observers noted. He stayed exactly where he was, in the exact house associated with Camille's disappearance, drawing on her money and running her farm, for years, in full view of a village that had every opportunity to grow suspicious and mostly didn't, or didn't act on it if they did. That composure, though, has a cost. And by around 1902 and into 1903, cracks were beginning to show. Not in Dougal's confidence, which by most accounts never wavered, but in the situation around him. The money, for one thing, was becoming harder to access as cleanly as it once had. Whether Camille's bank had begun to grow more cautious, whether some transaction had raised a question that couldn't be smoothly answered, or whether Dougal had simply grown careless after years of things going his way, the details vary by account. Something eventually caused enough friction that questions started reaching people outside the immediate circle of the farm. There's also the matter of Camille's family, whose patience, after nearly 4 years without any direct contact with her, appears to have finally run out. At some point in this period, concern seems to have solidified into something closer to formal inquiry. Questions were asked, of the bank, and eventually of the police, about the whereabouts of Camille Holland, a woman of independent means who had, as far as anyone outside Moat Farm could establish, effectively vanished from all contact with everyone who had once known her. It's a strange thing, reconstructing this part of the story, because so much of the drama that eventually followed hinges on this slow accumulation of small doubts rather than any single dramatic revelation. Nobody woke up one morning in 1903 and suddenly knew that Camille Holland was dead. What happened instead was quieter and, in its way, more unsettling, a gradual, mounting sense among a handful of people, a bank official here, a relative there, eventually a local police officer. That something about the story didn't sit right. That a woman who had been careful and organized her entire life didn't simply vanish without a trace and stay silent for years while her companion lived comfortably off her money. By early 1903, that mounting unease had reached a point where someone, finally, decided to act on it. Police inquiries began, cautiously at first, the way these things tended to in an era without much precedent for investigating a disappearance this old and this cold. Officers started asking questions in Clavering. About Camille. About Dougal. About the exact circumstances of that afternoon drive back in May of 1899, and everything that had, and more tellingly hadn't, happened since. And Dougal, for the first time in nearly 4 years, found himself having to answer questions from someone who wasn't inclined to simply take his word for it. Next time, in our final chapter, the investigation that followed. What the police found when they finally started looking closely at Moat Farm, and what 4 years of silence had been hiding, the whole time, just beneath the surface of that old moat. What the ground revealed. By March of 1903, the questions being asked in Clavering had stopped being quiet. Police inquiries into Camille Holland's disappearance had picked up real momentum. Detectives had started tracing the forged bank documents, following the money that had moved out of Camille's accounts over the previous 4 years, and the trail, unsurprisingly, once someone finally bothered to follow it properly, led directly back to Samuel Dougal. He was arrested in March 1903, initially on charges related to the forgery. Not murder. Not yet. At this stage, the case against him was built on paper, forged signatures, fraudulent transfers, financial documents that didn't hold up once someone with real investigative training started examining them closely. It was, in its way, the kind of case that could have ended there. A con man caught defrauding a missing woman's estate, sentenced for financial crimes. The actual fate of Camille Holland left as an open, unanswered question. But the police weren't satisfied with that. And this is where the story turns from a financial fraud investigation into something much darker. Investigators returned to Moat Farm. They interviewed Florence and other former household staff, piecing together, for the first time with any real rigor, a timeline of exactly what had happened in the days and weeks around Camille's disappearance back in May of 1899. And what emerged from those interviews was unsettling in its specificity. Florence recalled the afternoon drive. She recalled Dougal returning alone. She recalled being told that Camille had gone to London. And she recalled, crucially, that no luggage had ever actually left the house, that nothing about the sudden departure Dougal described had matched what she'd actually observed with her own eyes at the time. There was something else too, a detail that had meant nothing to a servant girl in 1899, but meant everything to a detective in 1903. Around the time of Camille's disappearance, there had been unusual activity around the farm's grounds. Digging. Dougal had, apparently, spent some time working on the property himself in the days following that final drive, work he'd explained, at the time, as ordinary farm improvements. Nobody had questioned it. Why would they? A man doing work on his own land wasn't remarkable. It became remarkable very quickly once investigators started looking at where, specifically, that digging had taken place. The search of Moat Farm's grounds began in earnest. And it was slow, grim work. The kind of methodical, unglamorous investigation that true crime stories sometimes skip past in favor of the dramatic reveal, but which in reality took days of careful, deliberate effort. Police and workers searched the grounds around the farmhouse, paying particular attention to areas near that old moat, where the ground had clearly been disturbed at some point in the past and never quite settled back to its original state. On the 27th of April 1903, nearly 4 years, almost to the week, after Camille Holland vanished from that afternoon drive, searchers found her. Her body was recovered from a filled-in section of the moat, buried beneath the ground that had, for 4 years, simply looked like part of the farm's landscape. The examination that followed confirmed what investigators had by this point come to suspect. Camille Holland had died from a gunshot wound. She had been shot, evidence suggested, at close range, consistent, investigators believed, with having been killed during or shortly after that final drive with Dougal on the 19th of May 1899, the same day he'd returned to the farm alone and told Florence that Camille had gone to London. 4 years. She had been lying in that ground for 4 years, while Dougal lived in the house above her, brought other women through its doors, spent her money, and told anyone who asked that she was simply away, visiting family, and would be back eventually. Dougal was charged with murder. The trial that followed, held in June of 1903, drew considerable public attention, the kind of case that Victorian and Edwardian newspapers found endlessly compelling. A respectable woman, a charming and dishonest companion, a body hidden for years beneath an old English moat. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. The forged financial documents, showing a clear motive and a clear pattern of fraud stretching back to the very days after Camille's disappearance. The testimony from Florence and other witnesses, establishing that Dougal's account of Camille's departure had never matched the physical reality of what anyone had actually observed. The physical evidence from the farm itself, the gunshot wound, the location and condition of the burial, the timeline that lined up, with grim precision, against the last day anyone besides Dougal had seen Camille alive. Dougal maintained his innocence throughout. He offered explanations, vague, shifting, never quite accounting for the specific details that the prosecution kept returning to. It didn't hold up. It hadn't held up, really, from the moment investigators started actually checking his story against the physical evidence, rather than simply accepting it the way the village of Clavering had accepted it, unquestioned, for 4 long years. The jury convicted him. Samuel Herbert Dougal was sentenced to death and executed by hanging on the 14th of July 1903 at Chelmsford Prison. Accounts from the execution describe a man who, even at the very end, never offered a full and honest confession to what he'd done, though some reports suggest he made a brief, partial acknowledgement of guilt in his final moments, the kind of last-minute admission that came far, far too late to matter to the woman he'd killed 4 years earlier. It's worth sitting for a moment, with everything that had to go wrong for this story to unfold the way it did. Not wrong in the sense of bad luck, wrong in the sense of every small, human, understandable failure that let a lie survive for 4 years when a closer look, at almost any point along the way, might have unraveled it far sooner. A bank that didn't verify a signature closely enough. A village that noticed something was strange and talked about it at the pub instead of acting on it. A family that gave a private, independent relative the benefit of the doubt for far longer than, in hindsight, they probably should have. A young servant girl who had no power, no standing, and no reason to think anyone would believe her over her employer's confident, well-spoken companion, even though she'd seen, with her own eyes, that the story never quite added up. None of these failures were malicious. That's what makes this story land the way it does, all these years later. Nobody in Clavering wanted Camille Holland to disappear and be forgotten. They simply didn't have a reason, day to day, to push past the confident man's confident lie, and Samuel Dougal, whatever else you want to say about him, understood exactly how to exploit that particular, ordinary kind of human trust. Camille Holland was 56 years old when she died. A woman who had spent decades building a careful, independent life, her own money, her own decisions, her own quiet routines. Only to have that independence, in the end, become the very thing that made her vulnerable to a man who specialized in finding women exactly like her. She's buried today in the churchyard at Clavering, not far from the farm where she died, the same farm that, for 4 years, kept her secret better than any person ever could have. The moat is still there, if you know where to look. Quieter now, the way places tend to go quiet once the story attached to them has finally, fully come to light. And somewhere in the record of a case that shocked Edward in England, in old newspaper columns, in trial transcripts, in the brief, careful testimony of a servant girl who noticed more than anyone gave her credit for at the time, Camille Holland's story survives. Not the story Samuel Dougal told about her. Her own. This has been the story of Camille Holland and the Moat Farm Murder. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sleep well.